Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's broadcast, Membrane-Based Water for Injection. I'm Rita Peters, Editorial Director of Pharmaceutical Technology and the moderator for today's event. We're pleased to bring you this web seminar presented by Pharmaceutical Technology and sponsored by Evoqua Water Technologies. With over 100 years of experience in pharmaceutical water treatment, Evoqua provides the technologies and solutions needed to meet the regulatory water requirements and challenging production demands of the pharmaceutical industry. Whether you need pretreatment, production of high purity and WFI water, or wastewater treatment, Evoqua has the expertise and experience to meet your application needs. And with Evoqua's Water One services, the company can design, build, and maintain your system for a simple monthly fee, so you don't have to worry about your water. We have a few important announcements before we begin. This webcast is designed to be interactive, and we encourage you to ask questions during the event. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. You can enlarge the slide window by clicking on the small square icon in the upper right-hand corner of the slide window, or by hovering your mouse over the lower right-hand corner and dragging the window to the desired size. The slides will advance automatically during the event. If you have any technical problems viewing or hearing the presentation, please click on the question mark Help widget in the dock at the bottom of your presentation window. Before we get started on the presentation and meeting the speakers, I'd like to get the audience involved in a brief polling question. You can click directly on your screen to submit your response. And here's the question. What has prevented you from considering membrane-based WFI systems? Lack of knowledge? Water quality concerns? Past European pharmacopoeia regulations? Cost uncertainties? Or validation requirements? Again, the question is, what has prevented you from considering membrane-based WFI systems? Lack of knowledge? Water quality concerns? Past European pharmacopoeia regulations? Cost uncertainties? Or validation requirements? So just make your selection and click Submit. And thank you for participating in our first poll. Now I'd like to introduce today's speakers. Gary Zaccolante has more than 45 years of experience in the design, operation, and troubleshooting of pharmaceutical water systems. He holds a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering from Northeastern University and was pharmaceutical technical director at Evoqua Water Systems for over 35 years. He's been involved in the development of equipment for pretreatment, reverse osmosis, deionization, ultrafiltration, and distillation. Gary's a member of the ISPE Critical Utilities Community of Practice Steering Committee. He's worked on the development of the ISPE Good Practice Guide, Commissioning and Qualification of Pharmaceutical Water and Steam Systems, Editions 1 and 2. Gary is a frequent lecturer for many pharmaceutical groups and has chaired many courses. He has presented for ISPE, Interfex, American Institute for Chemical Engineers, American Society for Mechanical Engineers, Institute for Pharmaceutical Research, Center for Professional Advancement, PDA, PharmTech, Barrett International, and many others. He's authored and co-authored many papers on pharmaceutical water production and system operation and maintenance. He also holds several patents for pharmaceutical water processes. Rich Jarrett is Evoqua's Pharmaceutical Marketing Director, leading efforts around water treatment solutions and product requirements for the pharmaceutical industry. He has more than 14 years of experience working with the pharmaceutical industry in developing products and services for improved quality, reduced cycle time, enhanced manufacturing, and regulatory compliance. So thank you both for being here today. Rich, please get us started.
Thank you, Rita, for that introduction. I'm Rich Jarrett, Evoqua's Director of Marketing for the pharmaceutical industry. Many of you may have known us as Penfield, US Filter, or Siemens Water Technologies. With leading brands such as Vantage, Iron Pure, and Memcor, Evoqua provides services and solutions that provide improved manufacturing uptime and operating efficiency. With over 200,000 system installations around the world, Evoqua has the technologies and expertise you need to keep your plants running. With the recent harmonization of water for injection pharmacopoeias, Evoqua has seen an increased interest in alternative methods of producing WIFI. We're pleased to present this webinar, which will provide you with an overview of the critical regulatory requirements for WIFI production, key process considerations you need to keep in mind when designing your WIFI system, a review of a number of case studies based on membrane technology, and a look at WIFI system economics. Evoqua is always available to answer your questions and respond back to any water needs you may have. You can reach us by getting in direct contact with me at richard.jarrett@evoqua.com or by using the Contact Us link on our website at www.evoqua.com. I'm pleased to have Gary Zuccolanti, a leading industry water expert, present today's webinar on membrane-based water for injection systems, providing you with an improved alternative for the production of WIFI.
Thank you, Rich. We're going to talk about why you would want to consider membrane systems. So what are the possible benefits of a membrane system to make water for injection in comparison with distillation? And the capital cost can be lower, as much as 70% lower. Operating costs could be 90% or greater reduced from distillation. Some of the critical quality attributes may be better, meaning potentially lower endotoxin, lower total organic carbon, lower conductivity. The footprint or space requirement is very likely to be reduced. The utility impact is likely to be much reduced in comparison with distillation. So it's not just a matter of possibly saving in operating costs with lower utilities, but one should consider the impact on a steam plant, on a chiller plant, that there may be additional savings there. The overall water recovery from membrane systems can be comparable to distillation systems. Depending upon the configuration, it could be superior. And these systems, membrane-based WFI systems, can be all new, but portions can be retrofit and to potentially be added to take a portion of existing purified water systems, further purify that to produce water for injection. So very practical new, but also very practical in retrofit situations for very attractive economics. If we look at the history of membrane-based WFI production, it does not compare with distillation systems out there, and much of that was lack of worldwide regulatory approval. The European Pharmacopoeia was distillation only for WFI until April of 2017. Since that time, there's been much greater interest in alternative methods to distillation. If we look at when RO was first able to be used in the United States, the U.S. Pharmacopoeia allowed reverse osmosis as a terminal process alternative to distillation in 1975. I was actually working in the pharma water industry at that time. I worked on some of the earliest systems. And although there was pretty good success in these alternative RO systems, reverse osmosis was not nearly as advanced as today. The RO elements at that time were not hot water sanitizable, and chemical sanitization can be effective, but it is not nearly as effective as heat. The membrane construction, they were not machine-made at that time. They were not as consistent in quality, and full-fit elements were not available. That is the construction where some water's allowed to flow around the outside of the element, between the outer wrap of the element and the pressure vessel, and that makes a big difference in microcontrol. In those early systems, endotoxin attainment, conductivity, and in those days it was wet chemistry, but the equivalent of conductivity and total organic carbon, those were not the areas of failure. It was sporadic failures in micro, the 10 colony forming units per 100 mil for water for injection. And even though they were not common, the sporadic failures in some instances discouraged more use. So it was proven that it could work, but the designs were not nearly as consistent as today. How has WFI been historically produced? Well, again, because 100 plus years ago, distillation was the only practical method, and then their regulators not allowing use in many parts of the world, most WFI is still produced by distillation. Now, it's not fair to say that no membrane WFI systems exist. They do. There is a small percentage of the legacy systems are membrane. But when Europe introduced highly purified water in 2002, that specification is identical to WFI in water quality attributes. There was not the distillation requirement. So nearly 100% of HPW systems that went in were membrane. They had a great success record. That is a big part of Europe modifying the regulations to allow alternatives to distillation. And in other markets, we'll take a quick look to see that in markets outside of pharmaceutical, membrane systems are dominant and there are virtually no distillation units in some other high purity markets. If we look at laboratory water, ASTM has several standards for lab water that are popular. If we look in the type 1 column, we will see that the conductivity, it's nearly the theoretical limit and much lower than USP conductivity. The total organic carbon is 100 parts per billion versus 500 parts per billion for WFI. And if you look below that at type A water, the micro limit for ASTM type 1, type A is 1 log tighter than WFI, and the endotoxin is nearly a log tighter. And these are simple laboratory units, principally plastic construction, chemically sanitized. I am not recommending these simple lab units to make water for injection for human injectable drugs. The point is that these simple chemically sanitized systems still consistently produce water of a much higher purity than water for injection. If we look next at ASTM microelectronics water, electronics water is not regulated. These are recommended standards for production of advanced devices. Again, these are 100% membrane-based systems, far lower conductivity than USP. The bacteria limit is 3 logs tighter than water for injection. Total organic carbon less than a part per billion versus 500. And the note about endotoxin non-detectable, that is many years ago it was thought that endotoxin could be good to detect early micro problems, perhaps faster than micro incubation methods. That thought failed because all of the tests that were run on the membrane-based electronics water, the endotoxin was non-detectable, so it could not be used to trend. So these are all membrane-based systems producing water far tighter quality than WFI. So let's take a quick look at regulatory requirements. In the U.S., that in red, water produced by distillation or a process that's equivalent or superior to distillation in removal of chemicals and microorganisms, therefore no process restrictions, open to all. If we look at the Japanese pharmacopoeia, it is again distillation to compare with, or by reverse osmosis and or ultrafiltration produced from water, which is their drinking water equivalent, or from purified water. So it is open to, it could be purified water by ion exchange and then followed by ultrafiltration. So here we see both membranes mentioned, reverse osmosis and ultrafiltration, but not a strict requirement to use both as an alternative. If we look now at the new European guidelines, distillation or RO, which may be single pass or double pass, so either 1 or 2 pass RO coupled with appropriate techniques such as electrodeionization, ultrafiltration, or nanofiltration, the water quality of all of these 3 major pharmacopoeial groups is the same for critical quality attributes. So here again, although both membrane processes are mentioned, RO and ultrafiltration, it's not an explicit requirement for both. So we'll look at what's the logic of how to put these systems together. Europe also has an EMA guide for non-distillation WFI, and the word consider is used throughout. So there are not necessarily explicit requirements, but appropriate materials should be considered. Sanitization is mentioned throughout, and more than one method is recommended. So hot water, steam, ozone, and chemical are proposed. Ozone is not compatible with generation equipment typically, just storage and distribution, but it means you could consider ozone and heat, ozone plus chemical, heat plus chemical. It mentions consideration of 2-pass reverse osmosis, but does not require it, and expressly states that a system such as reverse osmosis, electrodeionization, ultrafiltration could be appropriate. It recommends consideration of rapid test methods for micro and endotoxin and significant monitoring, which makes sense in systems of this type, conductivity, TOC, possibly microendotoxin rapid, but certainly, of course, done laboratory, if not rapid or both, and chlorine and ozone if they're used. So those are considerations for construction. If we now look at considerations to put these systems together, in a WFI membrane system, I think that hot water sanitization should be a requirement or a robust alternative. However, from a practical point, what is robust in generation equipment? Chemical is. And chemical has been proven to be able to work decades ago, but it's not as effective as heat, as automated, as verifiable, not as practical for frequent use because there's typically greater membrane damage from chemical than from heat. Steam is not really applicable to membrane systems, so the hot water by default is by far the most effective method and I think appropriate for these systems. Hygienic construction we'll talk about in more detail. It is not explicitly required, but we'll talk about why it's probably logical for these systems, certainly appropriate controls and instrumentation. What about multiple microendotoxin barriers? The USP monograph does not require it. A 1993 FDA guide mentions 2 passes of RO but doesn't require it. The European Pharmacopoeia discusses more than one membrane type, doesn't require it, nor does JP. However, I think in these systems, multiple membrane barriers are good practice, the best engineering practice, and may be very helpful in audit because you cannot know exactly what inspectors are going to be looking for because there's discussion of multiple membranes. I think that it's logical for these systems. Now, what about two-pass RO or product-staged RO, where the product from the first pass is purified again? Two-pass RO directly can produce WFI without ultrafiltration as a polisher and has in multiple systems. It's not required by the monographs. If you have a single pass of RO plus ultrafiltration, I don't think a second RO is needed. It can double the energy requirement for the energy to drive the second pass. Now, there could be a process need as opposed to regulatory for two-pass. The electrodeionization units that are going to be used in most of these systems have feed water requirements. That is relatively low silica and hardness certain metals. So on some feed waters, two-pass RO could be needed for the electrodeionization spec, or if there's a very tight critical quality attribute, low total organic carbon, very low conductivity, then a second pass of RO could be logical. But in most cases, single pass RO, CDI is not shown there, or electrodeionization. It should be an ultrafiltration. It's proven in many cases. Let's look at some configurations. We have a lot of material we're going to step through pretty quickly. Here, two-pass or product-staged reverse osmosis. Years ago, when the terminal process under USP was limited to distillation or RO, several of these systems went in. And here we have softening for scale control. We have activated carbon that is the most common dechlorination method upstream of RO. It could be sulfite injection or chemical injection or ultraviolet light, but hot water sanitizable carbon is the most common, and then two passes of reverse osmosis. And if we look at the history of these units, they're very good in attainment of TOC, endotoxin, and micro requirements for WFI. The conductivity is a little harder to predict. They're almost all going to attain at least stage 2 conductivity. They may attain stage 1 conductivity, but holding that steadily without operator intervention, that can be difficult due to management of ammonia and carbon dioxide. But they can produce WFI, a configuration like this, and even in the days of chemical sanitization, no hot water, the history was still pretty effective. Now, a very common configuration now is a single pass of reverse osmosis, continuous deionization, and a final ultrafilter. So here again, it could be softener or antiscalant. We talked about the methods of dechlorination. There's almost always filtration upstream of RO, possibly UV, but the real working units, a hot water sanitizable RO, continuous deionization, and ultrafiltration. There are many of these systems out for highly purified water. There are some out, we'll talk about some case studies for WFI. So this is a very popular configuration. All of the critical quality attributes easily attained. The whole system can be hot water sanitized. All the operational modes automated, and a significant history to go back to. The first case study, this is a fairly recent single-pass RO, continuous deionization, ultrafiltration, hot water sanitizable, a direct feed to the loop and the use points. The water consumption well understood, storage not needed. What is the history? Conductivity well below USP, TOC well below the limit, micro well below, endotoxin, many tests non-detectable, well below. And this system went through an FDA audit in 2018. So it is an alternative system to distillation. Successful operation has been through an FDA audit, And because of the nature of the facility makes branded parenteral drugs, but they also produce drugs in short supply, where perhaps another manufacturer had a manufacturing issue. This system has been used to produce more than 300 parenteral drugs with a complete success record. Another case study, single-pass RO CDI ultrafiltration. This was designed to produce European pharmacopoeia highly purified water. The water is stored at 80 C. The loop is maintained at 24 C and hot sanitized daily. Endotoxin is consistently non-detectable in generation and storage. The micro is basically at the limit of detection consistently, and this system has been in operation for 12 years, so proven over a lengthy period. The next case study is a very large system with a very lengthy history. 18 years of operation, 250 GPM product flow of WFI water. The final process is a ceramic ultrafilter operating continuously at 80 degrees C. There have been no failures for endotoxin or micro, consistent Wi-Fi production. Again, endotoxin below limit of detection and micro counts below 1 CFU per 100 long-term. And in this configuration, it's pre-treatment, hot water sanitizable RO, hot water sanitizable CDI to storage. There are some other purified water uses with that water. Water is then heated prior to the ultrafilter, and that continuous hot UF has produced continuous WFI for an 18-year period. The test results here are not from this system. This is a major test run by a leading pharma company to test ultrafiltration. If you look in the center column at feed endotoxin, there's endotoxin at times over 13,000 EU per mil. That was created. You'll never find that in a water system. The system was designed to concentrate up endotoxin, but every test that they ran was below the limit of detection, and at times a greater than 5 log reduction of endotoxin, and this is also achievable with other types of ultrafilter elements. UF can be part of a great low-cost solution, high water recovery up to 100%, low driving pressure, so low energy, significant history, some UF elements. Many are capable of hot water sanitization. Fewer are capable of continuous hot, but some are. A good history of 4+ log reduction, and unlike RO, integrity testing possible. So many UFs have diffusive air types of integrity tests and a solid history in pharma, both in water production and active ingredient production. The last case study now goes back to the days when USP only allowed distillation or reverse osmosis as the final process. This is why this got configured. And the final TOC consistently below 15 ppb, endotoxin and micro at very low levels. And there was a sister facility with a distillation system. This facility they opted to put in RO, and the cell culture in this facility was better, which they attributed to, they believed, the lower total organic carbon for membrane made for better cell culture in the facility. And in that system, it had pre-treat, hot water sanitizable RO, off-site regenerated resin that could be hot water sanitized, then to a tank heated and through the final hot water sanitizable RO, and a very successful production record for water for injection. We're going to very quickly look at equipment in the interest of time. And if we look at this system, this is an Evoqua VRX platform But we're talking about the attributes. It's all hygienic construction. It's all hot water sanitizable. In this particular platform, it's pre-skidded, pre-mounted, pre-wired. And in flows up to maybe 60 gallons a minute, the pre-skidding small footprint is very popular. But the key really is hygienic construction and hot water sanitization. The configuration, it's single pass or a two-pass RO, CDI, final UF, many options in pre-treat. And this is the type of equipment that can reliably produce WFI. If we move ahead to higher flow systems where an entire system on one skid isn't as practical, let's look at those skids a little, talk about construction. Hygienic construction, it may not be an explicit regulatory requirement, but it's a good part of biofilm control. It can make for more effective sanitizations. It frequently reduces sanitization frequency. And in an audit, this type of construction, you can't know what every auditor is going to expect. But look, stills are made in sanitary construction. So alternative skids, it's logical to me to also do that. And here's a carbon unit with hygienic construction. ROs can have all sanitary tubing and valves. The same with electrodeionization units, the same with ultrafilters. So they can all be constructed for hot water construction or sanitization, and they can all be in a hygienic construction. And I think that this construction is going to be successful in audit. Economics, I tread lightly. I encourage all of you do your own numbers. I tried to pull operating costs and capital for you to compare systems. Moving quickly, vapor compression stills, some the pre-treat is as simple as softening in carbon, sometimes a polishing softener for ammonium reduction. Some have reverse osmosis pre-treat. Many reasons to consider RO or not. There are systems that operate without and ones that with, and so the presence of RO or not affects the economics slightly. In multiple effect stills, a little different. They operate much hotter than VC. They can have chloride stress corrosion, silica scale, hardness scale. So multiple effect stills typically have extensive pretreatment. In many cases, the still feed system is making water for injection quality, and that has been proven in many studies. So potentially, the feed to multiple effect is producing WFI, but the presence of a typically extensive membrane system is going to add to the capital and operating economics. We looked at a typical single-pass RO CDI UF system, so we're going to move on. And two-pass RO, we have also stated, can make WFI. Now, in water recovery, VC distillation I've seen as high as 95%. Depending on the pre-treat and the feed water, the recovery may be as low as 75%. In the same range, but because there's typically water loss from a membrane system plus still blowdown, this configuration can be the lowest. In a typical RO CDI UF, 75% was popular for decades because no one was really too worried about water recovery. Today, with enhanced water recovery, that's typically an additional RO working on the main RO waste. That recovery can be as high as 95%. So all can be relatively low, all can be very high total water recovery. If we just look at energy now, and this is key, this isn't a consideration of water costs, this isn't a consideration of maintenance, it's purely energy. I'll show you numbers, I encourage you to do your own. Based on national averages, I could find just over $20 a 1,000 pounds of steam 7 cents a kilowatt hour and doing cost per 1,000 gallons of water. There are numbers you can see for 4 effect and 6 effect multiple effect, because in the U.S., we don't see a lot of 7 and 8 effect stills. In Europe, that is more predominant. You can get those numbers. The vapor compression is typically a much lower, and because of possible pre-treat, RO there or not, a hot distillate, a cold distillate, there's a range lower than multiple effect. But if you look at membrane, it could be as low as 50 cents a 1,000 gallons without water heating, depending upon water heating, motor efficiency, the type of electrodeionization device. Even with water heating, it is still going to be much lower typically than distillation. So a chance, if we look at an annual cost example, 25 gallon a minute WFI production, 250 days a year, 16 hours a day. We see a 4 effect still could be as high as 374,000 a year. A 6 effect is going to reduce it. Vapor compression is going to be even lower, but a membrane system can be far lower and not only be a lower capital cost to begin with, but offer tremendous operating cost advantages. In capital cost, I again encourage you, go get all of your own numbers, but here are some examples. So in 10 gallons a minute, a multiple effect still takes a fair amount of pre-treat. That could be chemically sanitized or hot water sanitized, so there's a big range. But it may be as much as 600,000 capital. For vapor compression, a small VC still is much more expensive than a similar size multiple effect still. That is typical. The pre-treat may be simpler. So again, there's a range. But the membrane-based system, and that would be based on hot water sanitizable, all stainless hygienic construction, and it may be half to a third of the capital. Moving up to a mid-size system, 50 GPM, vapor compression, and I don't have multiple effect because most cases when the flow is this high, many more installations of vapor compression than multiple effect. The pre-treat, again, can vary significantly, but the cost of an all-sanitary, hot water sanitizable membrane system is very likely to, again, be maybe a third of the capital cost. So both the operating expense can be lower and the capital cost can be significantly lower. We're going to talk very briefly about storage and distribution because that may be another area where membrane-based WFI systems may offer savings. There are 2 practical methods for sanitization of storage and distribution for WFI, and that is hot. Now, that could be continuous hot, and when a still is producing hot distillate, the storage is almost always continuous hot. It could be intermittent hot, but in many more cases than not, it's continuous hot storage. Here we see a hot loop and we see a cooled loop because in pharma plants, more WFI is used at ambient, say 25 C, than at 80 C. So here there is a cost not to heat. The trimming heat is relatively small because it's an insulated system and the still produced hot, let's say in this example, but there's a significant cost to cool that water to 25 C, and we'll look at some numbers. If we look at an alternative, and this is very practical with membrane-based systems, although the product water could be heated, one of the case studies I showed you, the product water was heated and stored at 80 degrees C. But in most cases, the water is going to be stored at ambient, and ozone is highly recommended in that EMA guideline for non-distillation-based systems. Ozone is growing in pharma water at a very rapid rate. And here, this is a very simplified drawing, so it is not reflecting details of how the ozone is introduced into the tank, but in principle, the tank is always under protection of ozone in storage. It's monitored so that pre-ultraviolet light, a proper ozone level shows. In service mode, the ultraviolet light is on. There is no ozone in the water used in production. So from a utility cost comparison now, in a hot storage system with cooling, we're going to look at a typical cooling cost, and we're going to look at the energy cost to maintain or to operate an ozone system. So here in our example, we use a 5,000-gallon tank and a 100 GPM distribution loop. The power cost for the ozone generator, this happens to be an example of corona discharge generator. The ozone generator plus the ultraviolet light annual power cost at the national average 7 cents a kilowatt hour is under $2,000. Cooling cost varies depending on the chiller, whether it's air-cooled or water-cooled. I used an average power cost in the middle of those two types. And in our example, and this is not a 365-day, this is 250 operating days a year. But that cooling cost from 80C to 25C would be about $87,000. Again, it could be lower or higher depending on the chiller economics, but I point this out to show that not only can there be operating cost advantages in generation, there could be operating cost advantages in storage and distribution. So where does this bring us? It brings us to the point now that on a nearly worldwide basis, systems do not have to be distillation. They can be alternative process, such as reverse osmosis, continuous deionization, and ultrafiltration. Those systems have been long proven both in pharma and in other markets. They can offer significant life cycle cost reduction. And there are many things to consider when picking the right system: reliability, maintenance, operating cost, capital cost. The utility cost is part of operating cost, but utility impact is you may have a drastically reduced steam requirement, a drastically reduced chilled water requirement, and so there may be additional capital savings to be realized in the utility plant, and of course the regulatory requirements. So now we would like to move to a poll question, and then we will open it up after that to general questions.
So thank you for the informative presentation. Before we start the Q&A portion, I'd like to ask the audience to participate in our second polling question. Again, just click directly on the screen to submit your response. And the question is, what do you see as the top 3 benefits of membrane-based WFI generation systems? Capital cost savings, operating cost savings, water quality, ease of operation, or reliability? Again, the question, what do you see as the top 3 benefits of membrane-based WFI generation systems? Capital cost savings, operating cost savings, water quality, ease of operation, or reliability? So make your selection and click Submit. And thank you for participating in our polls.
Now let's move on to our Q&A. So just a quick reminder to the audience that you can submit questions by entering them in the Q&A box, which is you can find on the right-hand side of your presentation window. So let's go with our first question. do membrane WFI systems have any throughput limits? What's the maximum GPM flow rate I can build?
There really is no throughput limit. There are individual RO skids, electrodeionization skids at many hundreds of GPM. And by the nature of the way they're constructed, in RO with pressure vessels and multiple elements per vessel, there's not really a practical limit there. The same electrodeionization modules, ultrafilter modules, there are individual flow limits for a given module, but typically in high flow systems, those systems, skids, are constructed with multiple modules. So there really is not a practical limit. In other markets, I mean, there are systems at thousands of GPM using these same processes in construction.
Okay, thank you. Here's the next question. Can we drill down on how we ensure clients are compliant with the current codes?
Well, it's a great question, and from a standpoint, as an example of USP, there have not been recent regulation changes. There have been, so the monograph does not have process restrictions per se, other than obviously it needs to be robust and something that can be demonstrated comparable to distillation. The Japanese pharmacopoeia, that language is many years old. So the big change, it's April of 2017 for the change in the European regulations. And so I think some of that is to play out. The monograph language, we went through a lot of the principles of that EMA guide, but I pointed out in most cases it's saying consider this, consider that. So I think that there's logic to multiple membrane barriers, as I stated. I think there's logic to hygienic construction. I think that the best sanitization methods of thermal for generation or thermal or ozone for distribution, and then with chemical as a backup, because almost any system can undergo chemical sanitization, and there are reasons that make chemical a good backup. As an example, there are chemicals that are good for biofilm removal in the unlikely event that that happens. But other than good practices, until there are more audits and we have a better understanding of exactly what inspectors are looking for, I think all we can do is read the guides that are there, use good engineering practice, and again rely on, in Europe, that these systems are going to look a lot like highly purified water systems, and success of membrane systems in production of exactly the same quality water as WFI, those systems had great success, and I don't see why similar systems shouldn't be successful in this endeavor.
Okay, thank you. Here's our next question. In the case where materials, filters are high temperature compatible, has superheated water sterilization been explored?
Yes, and I would say to a small degree. There's so much data for microbial control at 80 degrees C, 90 degrees C, where having to do it under pressure is not required. Most systems operate in that realm. Obviously, if the water is under pressure, it can go up above 100 C, And many years ago, the theory of steam years ago was for spore forms of bacteria where 121 C was a common number. But from a pharma standpoint, especially within ISPE as an example, steam is discouraged or stated to be not necessary, that high temperature water has been proven to be very successful. So I would say that yes, there's some use of superheated water, but I would say it's not nearly as common as water at 80 C and above. And that is for sanitization. There are many distribution systems successful at 65 C or 70 C, and that is for continuous high temperature. For intermittent, 80 C and up is the most common.
Okay, thanks. We have two questions related to reverse osmosis. So the first one is, does it have to be two-pass reverse osmosis? And the next one is, when do you think it would be necessary to use a two-pass reverse osmosis system to produce membrane WFI?
Well, look, as I am interpreting the regulatory requirements, certainly in Japan and US, there's really no mention of multiple passes. And again, in the US, they really don't give you a process description. In Europe, the EMA guide says to consider two-pass or product-staged RO. So I would say that it should be considered. I don't see it as a regulatory requirement. And I did point out cases where the process could require it, that it could be a high TDS water or a critical quality attribute. There could be a very low level, well below USP, EP limits that might drive two-pass. And then in some cases, because I've personally worked on systems like this, the electrodeionization devices, they have fairly tight feed water specifications. So it can be silica, there can be raw water contaminants that then the process would require two-pass RO to make the proper feed water to electrodeionization. But that's a process reason as opposed to a regulatory reason.
Okay, thank you. So next question, what is the molecular weight cutoff for UF membranes?
Well, there's a very wide range in UF, and some manufacturers put molecular weight cutoffs as low as 1,000 molecular weight. Some are rated at 6,000, 10,000, 80,000, 100,000. And I have seen from operational systems ultrafilters rated as high as 80,000 molecular weight cutoff, providing a 4-log reduction or better of endotoxin. So in my personal experience, I don't find that the molecular weight cutoff is important. I think manufacturers putting an endotoxin log reduction rating is important. So that way there's been some proven capability for the UF to do endotoxin reduction, so that then in feeling comfortable about the final water quality between a reduction, say in reverse osmosis, which isn't 100% preceding UF, but is in most cases, between the two membranes, obviously the system, you don't want it to project to just meet the critical quality attribute of endotoxin. You would want to be comfortably below. So I have seen a wide range of molecular weight cutoffs work, and then the debate becomes, if you're trying to satisfy a particular pharmacopoeial requirement, then is there any specific molecular weight mentioned that may want to be considered?
Okay, thank you. Next question. What is the benefit of ozone sanitation versus heat? Is there a time when you would use one over the other?
Well, both have been proven to be effective. There is a greater history of hot water sanitization in pharmaceutical water systems, a lengthier history than ozone, and probably more placements, and some of that coming that, as an example, if a still is producing hot water, then the water is likely stored hot, and then it can be used intermittently as a sanitizer for distribution. But I would say this, that if the water is going to be produced at ambient temperature, in more cases than not, ozone may be a more practical sanitizer, looking at an operating cost, or as opposed to continuous heat. We didn't talk much about intermittent heat. Intermittent heat can also be a practical sanitization method, but if I compare intermittent heat versus ozone, in intermittent heat, typically the whole system is ambient, and then periodically it's heated up. In contrast with ozone, the ozone is on the tank continuously in almost every application. And so the tank is under continuous protection of an agent lethal to bacteria. And then the loops that cannot have ozone in them for production, but do in sanitization, the loops are intermittently sanitized, but the tank is under continuous protection. And I think that is an advantage versus intermittent heat. All can work, and it often comes down to the impact on utilities. So ozone, there's not going to impact the steam plant or the chilled water plant. So I think that utility impact and operating costs are advantages that ozone can have, and that's why it's growing at a pretty rapid rate in this industry.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Is it possible for me to retrofit an existing purified water system to produce WFI water? Yes,
and that has been done, and I have had some personal experience to know that can be done. But many legacy purified water systems have all of the right components there. And since purified water and water for injection are the same chemically, that means a purified water system is already producing water that meets the conductivity and TOC. And many purified water systems, when measured, are producing water that's equivalent to water for injection. So the appropriate added component, and ultrafiltration is going to be common here, that a UF module could be added to assure attainment of endotoxin of the low microbial level required for water for injection. So I think that although many complete new systems of the membrane type will go in, I think it's logical that purified water will be a source for production of water for injection, and then only those components needed will be added. So I think it can prove to be quite practical.
All right, thanks. We have time for one quick final question. Can I add ultrafiltration to my DI system to produce WFI water?
I have actually worked on a couple of systems where that would be done, and I would say the DI systems or ion exchange, they are not going to be as common to be the source water for this endeavor. I think that RO electrodeionization or RO-DI systems are going to be more commonly the source, so that in a case of adding ultrafiltration to a DI system, there may not be a redundant membrane barrier, but if I'm being asked from a practical point, can the water quality be attained? I have seen it be attained, And some of these were in API production, where WFI quality water was needed. Technically, it wasn't called WFI, but I have seen, in fact, that process combination work to produce water of this quality. The bigger debate might be the very unknown from an audit standpoint. Would it be considered robust enough? And that's almost impossible to state what hundreds of inspectors or thousands over the world, how they would all react. But technically, I have already seen that work with the right makeup system in UF.
All right, well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. If your question was not answered during this webcast, it will be answered afterward. We'll reach out to you. I want to thank the audience for attending and participating in today's event, and like to thank the sponsor of Aqua Water Technologies for making today's webcast possible. You'll receive an email from Pharmaceutical Technology alerting you when the webcast will be available for replay. I invite you to forward that announcement to any of your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. So thank you again for joining us, and have a good day.